Welcome back, everybody, to the Virtual Residency Workshop 2023. It's Thursday, June 29th. This is our second session of the day. We are doing the third and final Cyber Ambassador session. It's really two sessions rolled into one: leading the change, equity and inclusion, and leading with principle ethics. So I'm going to turn the program over to Dirk Colbry and Mary Olson.
Thank you, Henry. Welcome, everybody. Obviously, the first thing I should do is share my screen. And there you go, Henry. Make sure you hit record, which you already did. So today we're going to be talking about equity, inclusion, and ethics. And my name is Dirk Colbry. If you haven't been to the other ones, I am a faculty in computational math, science, and engineering at Michigan State University. And I am the director of user support for our local large-scale computing system. And this is Mary.
Hey, Dirk. I'm Mary Olson. I work for Oracle, and I lead strategy for education and academic research.
And today we're going to be using some participant material. So I'll put this link in the chat there so that you can just click on it. Or if you want to use your phone, you can use the QR code. I don't care. And there's a tiny URL there. These materials will be helpful later. So I will try to repeat and put that link in later, but they just are we're going to do some breakout rooms, and there's materials you're going to review in your breakout rooms. That's in small groups. That's the plan, at least. So the agenda for today is we're going to give you a short welcome, which is going to be very short because we've done it already twice. And then we're going to talk about equity and inclusion, and then we're going to talk about ethics. And so let me give you this short introduction. I have to give this disclaimer that the National Science Foundation paid for the development of a lot of this curriculum. And so we got to give them credit, but a lot of other people also participated in the developing of the curriculum. It is open source. It is free to use. And we also will do a Train the Trainers event, which we're hoping to move online starting this fall. This has some really interesting topics, but sometimes they can get a little heated, and we want to make sure that everybody's respectful of everybody else. So if you're talking a lot and you're overly engaged, especially in your research in your breakout rooms, maybe take a step back and let other people engage. Similarly, in your breakout rooms, if you can, turn your cameras on, and if you're not engaging, try to take a step forward and engage if you can. It's okay if you're not. Everybody's in a different work environment. We understand. But what we're trying to do is create an interactive and have an opportunity to discuss some of these interesting topics. If something is ever said that is offensive, which can happen in some of these discussions, that is okay. We want to assume everybody's has good intentions, right? We want to assume that everybody has positive, and they just might have said something wrong. Instead of ignoring it, and we can talk about the value of why we don't ignore it, but we're going to say oops and ouch. So if you hear something that doesn't land very right on your ears, it is absolutely okay to say oops and say, hey, that didn't sound right. You can do that in the chat. You can do that out loud. It is not being confrontational. You say, oops, I assume you didn't mean to say a bad thing because we're assuming best intentions, but that might have been heard in it that way. And sometimes something slips out of your mouth that comes out wrong. And instead of waiting for someone to say, oops, or instead of saying, I did those backwards, by the way, sorry. If you hear something bad, you're supposed to say, ouch, because it hurt you. If you say something bad, you say, oops, and you try to correct it. And the idea is we're not ignoring things, and we're just trying to get it out there and do the best we can to have an open discussion. So this is also our third time doing a Cyber Ambassador thing, so you should be used to this by now. We're going to practice a chatter, and this one is just a way to engage the community. So we're going to ask you a question, and then I'll do a countdown, and it will go like this. It will go 3, 2, 1, chat. Sorry, I went really fast there. When I ask a question, I want you to type that question into the chat window, the answer to the question in the chat. And I want everyone to try to do it. So open up your chat window now because I'm going to make you do it in a second. And then when I say 3, 2, 1, chat, you're going to hit enter. So don't hit enter until I say 3, 2, 1, chat, enter. And then up on the screen will flow a waterfall of chats. And that's a way to get everybody to engage, to see what everybody is thinking. And so we're going to give that a try. So the question for today is, what is your favorite summer activity? So think about what your favorite summer activity is. And once that's written down, we're going to say 3, 2, 1, chat. So we have running, swimming, hiking, watching movies, going to the beach. Yeah, I love swimming with the kids, especially. That's super fun. Mountain biking, kayaking. Yeah, everybody loves summer. So that's the idea of how the session is going to go. We're going to do a few chatters. We're going to do breakout rooms where we'll explain what you're going to discuss in the breakout rooms. And then we'll come back to the big room to have group discussions. So I'm going to turn this over to Mary to go on with leading the change.
All right, can you see my
And
screen?
you shared your presentation slide, the presentation viewer, not the regular one.
Thank you. I made that mistake yesterday. How's that one? How's that one?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm getting used to this screen sharing. I haven't really done much of it before. So as I mentioned earlier, my name is Mary Olson, and what I do is lead strategy for Oracle for education and academic research. And I'm so fortunate I was able to attend the Cyber Ambassador Facilitator training this year, and I've taken many of the modules. I highly recommend them as they're very well researched, very well developed, and I personally have learned a lot from it, and I'm happy to be here today to share it. And so our agenda today is actually pretty simple, but the topic, as Dirk mentioned, is not simple at all. We'll understand bias, we'll determine the impact this has on us on our day-to-day basis, and we'll come up with some strategies for dealing with it. So at the end of the day, what you'll be able to do is be able to know why we have biases, what sources contribute to that, determine how this impacts some fields specifically, and then, as I said, have strategies for dealing with it. So that's what we'll do. And of course, we've already practiced chatter, but we're going to do another one. And before we do that, though, I really want to tell a story. And that's that when I first heard about this topic, I was so excited because I thought, great, now I get to help other people see where they're biased and how they can overcome it. Because of course, I'm not biased. I never have been, but I wanted the ability to deal with everybody else who's biased. So it's time to fire up the chatter. Open chat and type in there, what do you think bias is? Just a couple of words that represent bias to you. And so I'll give you a countdown here, give you a few seconds to type, and then I'll go ahead to the countdown. So 3, 2, 1. What do you think bias is? Preconceived notions, an assumption, a judgment without information. I think that's especially good. Conscious or unconscious thoughts, deciding without understanding reality. Boy, those are all fantastic examples. Really, I think we can all understand that there are biases and those are good examples. But for our definition for purposes today, what we're going to do is talk about bias as liking or disliking maybe a specific person or group, or something that's based on characteristics that in fact may be outside the control of the group you're dealing with. A lot of times they are outside the control, and so that will be our definition for bias for today. And so remember when I started out, I said that I was happy to learn about the topic because I'm not biased. Well, imagine my surprise when I dove into it and I realized that, yes, my brain is biased. I didn't recognize it, but humans have evolved to be able to use shortcuts. In fact, it was kind of like a survival mechanism for us. We had to be able to understand threats and react to them, and we couldn't take the time to process everything. And then as we began to grow, we had too much information coming at us. So we developed mechanisms that are really built on selective inputs and paying attention to certain things. And so this is going to date me a bit, but does anybody here drive a standard transmission with a clutch? I remember when I was first learning to drive one, I was so hyper-focused on letting the clutch out slowly so that I didn't kill the engine, that's all I could think about. Well, it wasn't a short time later that I realized that my brain could ignore the clutch and just focus on the driving. So that's kind of how we've adapted to really look at selective inputs. And of course, whether we want to or not, our social circles, our family, our friends, they do influence our bias, the people we work with. It just is something that happens. And so bias isn't necessarily something we can take away, but it is something we have to learn to recognize and deal with. And so we may know about certain biases, but what exactly are unconscious biases and where do they come from? So for our purposes, unconscious biases are really stereotypes. They're things that hit us without our actively thinking about them. And we may not even be aware of how we respond to somebody else's gender, their age, their race, how they look. These things do affect us on a regular basis. And there is a lot of research about how unconscious bias specifically affects us. So where does unconscious bias come from? I mean, you would kind of wonder, you think, I'm aware of everything I'm doing. How come I have unconscious bias? Well, there's one category that is defined as affinity bias. And it's really just our tendency to relate better to people who are like us. It's kind of natural that we understand them, they understand us, and so there is an affinity bias to it as well. In addition, there's something called confirmation bias. And with this, it's the experience of seeing what you expect to see. So I remember one time I was told that people who drive red cars drive faster and get more speeding tickets. I don't know if that's true, but I was told it. But the very next time I was on the highway, I noticed that red cars were speeding past my tan Toyota, and they were everywhere. So that's kind of an example of confirmation bias. In addition, there's something that's called perception bias. Now, I don't know if any of you were here in the Let's Talk session yesterday, but Jason Sims did that presentation and he gave a terrific example of perception bias. He mentioned that because he's from the South and has a Southern accent, there are some people who think, he's not maybe as smart as somebody who has, a British accent. That's an example of perception bias, and it's totally not true. And the last area we'll talk about here, well, actually not last, second to last, is something that's called anchor bias. And anchor bias comes by the first thing that you hear oftentimes sets a boundary. So an example of that is if you're in a salary negotiation, people don't want to be the first to put out a number because that either will set the high or the low, depending upon which side of the negotiation you're on. It sets an anchoring or a boundary for it. And the last one is probably one that you'll recognize in me, and it's the blind spot bias. I told you that I don't have biases, and that's because I don't necessarily recognize them. And in fact, my blind spot bias almost made me a little bit indignant when I took a look at the research, and yep, it proves indisputably that I definitely do have biases. And let's see, there was a comment in here from Sanjaya about bias being a result of groupism, which is necessary at one point in time. That's an excellent link. Thank you for posting that. I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're right. So thank you. In addition, so, when we understand that we have biases and we understand a little bit about how they come about, I think it's helpful for us to understand how that might be impacting us and the effect it could have on our work environment. So one way to start with that is by surfacing and understanding what our own unconscious biases are. So I like to start everything in research. And there is a project called Project Implicit that's hosted at Harvard. And it's a group of international collaborative researchers that study implicit social conditions and cognition, and they've been around for decades. There's a link to the website at the top of this page. If you take a look up here, there's a link to that website. And you can go to this website and take tests that will help you discover your own biases. It's called an implicit association test. It's been very well researched and very proven. So I took a couple of these tests myself, and I got some interesting results. The first one was gender bias. Now, I kind of thought by this time, I was thinking everybody had some kind of gender bias. Well, it turns out I don't. I don't have a single gender bias at all. It's completely no bias there at all. And so I stopped to think about that, about why would that be the case? And I realized that it was because the way I grew up. Both my father and mother worked, and my mother back in the 70s was, she ran an X-ray department for a large dental clinic. And back then, it wasn't common for women to run the department. If they were in dentistry at all, it was as an assistant or a hygienist. But my mom ran the department. And my dad, he worked full-time as a truck driver, a teamster, delivering milk for a dairy. And so because his job, he had to go to work so early, he went to work at 4 a.m. and was always home when the kids got home from school. So my grow-up experience was my dad, coming home to my dad, and he would give us a snack and help us with our homework and make dinner. And that was because my mom didn't get home till 6. So I think that contributed to the fact that I just don't have a gender bias because I didn't have an ordinary and normal upbringing. But I also took another test, and that was the one on mental illness. And I was pretty surprised that it turned out there was a pretty moderate to moderately strong bias against mental illness. I was frankly a little upset because I wasn't aware of this, and it was completely at odds with my moral compass. But in taking these tests, you might not agree with them, but just take them and see if you can figure out where that came from. And so I would recommend using this site and doing a bit of self-reflection to help you understand your own personal biases. And why is that important? Well, it's important because there is just a wealth of research, ongoing research, that demonstrates that specifically in STEM, unconscious bias is pervasive. And this has an impact on both people who are in the majority as well as people who are in the minority. Everyone is impacted by it. For example, I know a lot of women who won't pursue a job they're qualified for just because they're afraid of the bias that they just feel that they're not qualified for it. So what this ends up causing is that we have a deficit of individuals from underrepresented groups in these critically important fields. And that gives us a limited diversity of thought and experience, which we can all agree is suboptimal. So reflect for a minute. Have you experienced this personally, or do you know someone who has? You don't need to type it into the chat because I know that's kind of a sensitive subject, but just pause and think for a minute, because I think we can all agree that society would be better off if we tapped into every group's contributions for STEM. So let's make this a little bit more concrete for STEM by taking a look at how wording in job ads may encourage or discourage people from applying. So it's actually pretty subtle, and it is tied to culture, but language itself is gender coded. And while we don't really intend it to be that way, certain behaviors can be called different things, whether they're referring to a man or a woman. For example, an aggressive man might be described as confident, but a woman who had the same behavior could be described as bossy. And I know, I recall early on in my career, I was called by a customer a pushy broad, and I was doing exactly the same things that my male colleagues did. Well, studies have shown that if a job posting is dominated by words that are typically masculine, women tend to self-select out and they don't apply. But if the language is a bit more neutral or feminine, then both men and women are likely to apply. It doesn't screen out men. So if you want to increase your qualified applicant pool, a very simple action is to review the language in your job posting and try to make it more welcoming and encouraging and neutral. So on this slide, there's a link to an excellent website it's called the Gender Decoder. And what you can do is you can put text into this website and it'll compare it to a research verified listing of words that will tell you whether it's masculine or feminine leaning. And I'm happy to say I actually tried this yesterday because a teammate of mine posted a job opening, and I'm pleased to say that the job was actually balanced and leaning a bit towards feminine. So I was pretty pleased to see that. So now, we're going to put this into practice. And as Dirk mentioned, we're going to go into some breakout rooms. And what we'll do is in the link that Dirk posted in the chat is a link to the activity. You'll accept your breakout room. You'll have several people, and the first person whose name comes first alphabetically is going to be the timekeeper. There'll be 4 job descriptions posted. And those 4 job descriptions, pick just one of them at random, take a minute to read through it, and then discuss as a group how the words strike you and whether there's some different choices that you might make to make it more encouraging. And then talk for about 5 minutes or so, and then select another posting to read and make a comparison to. Then when we come back, we're just going to share a little bit of feedback via a chatter on how this was. So yes, can you post the link to that language thing? That's the gender decoder. Kirk, if you don't mind, that would be great. And you will get your breakout rooms, so please accept that link and turn your cameras on, and we'll come back in just about maybe about 10 minutes.
I think I did that right. So go ahead and join.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. It worked. Yay.
All right.
I'm going to post that link. I was doing too many things at once.
Yeah, when you're doing the links in the chat, there's a lot to do.
Well, I didn't think to pull them out like I usually do. And so I have to go back to the slides to grab them.
Oh, yeah.
Which is fine. That's why they're in the slides. But
yeah. So I was going to leave this up in case anybody came in, and I can't see the participants. So if there's somebody that needs to get assigned to a breakout room, can you do that, Dirk?
Yeah, I've got it in front of me. Everyone looks good.
Okay, awesome.
And it looks like we at least have 3 in every room, which should be sufficient.
Okay, great.
Dirk, I apologize. Could you stick me in a breakout room? I signed in with a computer, so I'd actually actively participate.
All right, then you get room 1.
Thank you.
And Horst, I assume, do you want to join? I assume you're just helping out. I don't know.
I would, except that I have a really bad cold, so I'm not talking today.
Okay. Well, yeah. You've seen this stuff before.
Dirk, do you typically give like a 60-second warning before they all rejoin the main group?
Yeah, usually when the breakout room automatically does that. So if I close the room, it will. I don't know actually if Henry has that set up.
Okay.
But I can do a broadcast in a few minutes and say,
okay,
we're coming back soon. Wrap up your discussion.
And we're on time. Or on target.
Oh, we're absolutely on time. You're doing awesome.
Okay, good.
I mean, I don't know. How much time did you say you were giving them?
About 10 minutes. And I think it's been about 2.5.
Yep. No, that's perfect.
Okay. I figured it with 10 minutes, they could go through two different scenarios.
Absolutely. All right. I will be right back.
Okay.
find it a little interesting that we lost quite a few people. Sorry about that, Henry. When we go to breakout rooms, people
Oh,
decide to log out.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely the norm.
oh dear. We should have kept
You-
them and not done a breakout room then, if I had realized that.
Well, it's a trade-off, right? If you can
Uh-huh.
accomplish certain things in the breakout room, then
Mhm.
you will get the benefit of that. But you should go in knowing that some people will drop out because they don't like breakout rooms. I have always been a little bit surprised at
Mhm.
how many people only want to passively consume whatever the content is.
Yeah.
Yeah, usually, and I didn't think to do it this time. Usually I have them put a Z in front of their name. Not do
Oh.
anything with that. But then if they don't have to log into they don't have to go to the room. And if they do go to the room, they can just, with the Z in front of the name, it alerts the other people in the room that they're not able to talk for some reason. That's what I usually do, but I didn't think to do it this time. I'll put it in the notes for next time.
Well,
Okay.
and in fairness, because I saw this yesterday too with the intake interviews, there's always a dozen or so people who either they have stepped away or they're in the middle of something else and they just don't go into their breakout room for whatever reason, and that's fine.
Mhm.
Well, I was going to say no one's here, but we just got a new person. Brett, welcome.
Henry, do some people drop and then come
you
back at the end of 10 minutes just to finish up?
Oh God, no. If they
No?
drop,
Okay.
they're gone for at least the rest of the session.
Okay. Okay. So it's hard not to take it personal, though.
You should never take any of it personally. You do not loom that large for them.
That's true.
bias.
That's true.
They
Yeah.
don't care enough about you for it to be personal.
Mhm. Yeah. Good advice.
Yeah, I remember a math teacher in high school once was threatening me as was going to give me a citation for something I did, and that would involve sending a letter to my parents. It was like, would give you a citation, but that could cost 50 cents of postage, and you're not worth that much.
Wow.
All right. I'm going to give a 1-minute warning.
Good
Does
idea.
that seem reasonable?
It seems very reasonable. I'm sure they've had plenty of time to chat. Mhm.
And then I give them a few seconds, and it looks like there's a 60-second wait. So
Mhm.
I'm going to hit close the breakout room now, and that will give them a full 60 seconds to come back. Sound good?
Okay. Sounds
Here
good.
they come.
Okay.
Well, 60 seconds from now.
Yeah,
I can give you a timer down when we get closer.
that sounds good.
And some of them will drop out of the breakout room on their own.
Mhm.
Yeah, we should start seeing people soon.
Okay.
You got about 10 seconds and then everybody's just going to pop on in.
Okay. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. I hope that you enjoyed that. Has everyone been able to rejoin and the breakout rooms are all closed? Okay, good. Well, I hope you guys found that to be a useful exercise. I know the first time I went through it, I found it a little bit difficult for me to understand which words were masculine and feminine, and it didn't always make sense. So I hope you guys enjoyed the practice. Let's do a very brief chat, or we won't take a lot of time on this one, but open the chat window and just type in briefly what you may have learned from this exercise. Were there any words specifically that you felt were encouraging or discouraging, or anything that you might like to change? So on a countdown, we'll go ahead and everybody can hit enter. So on 3, 2, 1. Let's see. Coachable was odd, adaptive, rigorous, it was excluding, passion, serve, and coachable. I assume those were positives. People's idea of gendered language is very diverse. That is very, very true. So when you go to these websites, and Dirk did post the link to the research on gender and the decoder, so you can take a look at that. Let's see, Jeremy also said it's discouraging. It feels that something that tends to cause problems within an organization. I agree. So hopefully this was a useful enough exercise for you. Just to share briefly, there were 4 research scientist postings. 2 of them, number 1 and 3, were more masculine dominated, and you can see the words like competitive, independent, driven, that are a little bit more masculine. And then in 2 and 4, commit, collaborate, enthusiastic were the other words. So that's how they scored in the gender decoder. So with that, I just recommend bookmarking that gender decoder, and when you have anything, definitely use it. So let's take a look at, now that we've kind of understand bias, where it comes from and how serious an impact it is, what can we do about this? So I think probably there's a few bias busting strategies we want to adopt. One of them, of course, we've talked about quite a bit, and that's just being aware. The basic awareness of your own biases and acknowledging these is critically important. You can do this by using the project implicit, or just by getting feedback. As I said, I didn't have any biases, but I can see biases in other people. So ask the other people in your life what you might have. In addition, try to figure out what might trigger you. I mentioned before, that I have a moderate bias against mental illness. And I noticed that when a colleague of mine was talking about his own mental illness and history of mental illness in his family, I kind of got this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, and it made me uncomfortable. And I think that's kind of a trigger of awareness for me. That might be something that I need to consciously set aside. And to do that, just kind of slow down, take a moment to yourself, acknowledge that the bias might be there, and just set it aside and try your best to deal with it. And last, you can't fix everything at once. You can't fix your entire institution or yourself. So just make small and consistent changes. Take steps towards identifying and removing your biases, and that will go a long way. And now, as a university, what can you do that's a little bit more specific when you're in hiring mode? And really, there's a lot that can be done. A key strategy is simply with the hiring committee that you're dealing with, make sure that they're trained, that they understand that bias exists, and that they understand they need to take active steps to overcoming it. Also, as we talked about, just exercise to increase the candidate pool. Make sure that you are reaching out to diverse groups, and that the wording you use is encouraging instead of taking people out. Another area is how you review candidates. Take a broader look at the candidate. Do a holistic review of their experience, and not just relying overly heavily on a certain set of metrics. That can certainly help you overcome the bias. And last, I can't recommend enough structured interviews. If you have a list of questions that you're going to ask every one of the candidates, you can review the wording ahead of time. You can also make sure there's consistency in how you do it. And even better, if you send it to the candidates in advance, they get the opportunity to think about it, because there are some people who just don't think on their feet quick enough. And that actually screens them out when they could be very, very good candidates. So I recommend using structured interviews and sending that out in advance. So if you do that, you should have a pretty strong impact on your institution. So I hope we've met our learning objectives today, and that you understand a little bit better about biases, where they come from. And I've acknowledged for myself that I do have a lot of biases, hidden biases, and that these can have consequences for us in the STEM fields. And I hope we've given you techniques to deal with that. So if there's any thoughts you want to share just briefly before we go to the next topic, go do so now. Otherwise, Dirk, I'm just going to turn it to you to talk about ethics.
I do have to unmute myself to make this work. And here, there's me. Everyone can see me now. Thank you, Mary. That was great. Great discussions. Let's keep going. So we're going to go move on to a slightly different topic. And like all the cyber ambassadors topics, we have learning goals. I won't go into them, but they're there. And this one, we're really focusing on ethics and how it applies in the workplace, and how we can have discussions about ethics by understanding them a little bit better. So we're going to talk a little bit about ethical decisions and behavior. Hopefully that will go quickly. And then I would like to have you go back into your breakout rooms and think about how ethics are handled in the professional setting. And we'll give you some case studies to go over and an ethical standard, and I'll explain a code of ethics. And then you can see how to apply that code of ethics to a standard and why that might be helpful. All right, so let's start by asking the $100 question, right? Hold on a second. Sounds funny. Nope, it's fine. Let's ask the $100 question. We're walking down the sidewalk, and there's $100 on the ground, right? You pick up the money and put it in your pocket. Is that ethical? Right? Is that an ethical thing to do? Some people might say yes, because it's just sitting there on the ground. Why can't I take it? Some might say no. It's an matter of opinion in some sense. But let's change that a little bit. Now you're walking down the sidewalk, see $100 ground on the bill, and then you look around to make sure no one's watching. No one is, so you pick up the money and you put it in your pocket. Does that change if this is ethical or not? This is a general question. You don't have to answer it. I just want you to say, are these two scenarios different to you? What if you saw someone drop it? Yes. So now someone walking down the sidewalk sees $100 bill fall out of someone else's pocket. They pick it up, put it in their pocket, and walk away. Now, is that unethical? Now, I'd argue most people would say the third scenario is unethical, but maybe a lot of people would say the first one is not. Is ethical. So third one's not ethical. The first one is ethical. But it is a varying opinion. And it's interesting because what happened didn't change that much. Someone saw a $100 bill on the ground, walked over and picked it up and put their pocket. They did the same thing in all three situations, but the context of the situation is what changed it from possibly being ethical to not ethical. And it will be a different of opinion on whether that first one is ethical or not. And we'll talk about that right now. So what we're gonna distinguish two types of failures when we're talking about ethics. And there's the first one is called failure of character. So we are all raised in a culture, in a context that teaches us what is right and what is wrong. That can be slightly different between cultures, and that's okay. Everybody is raised in this. Now, a failure of character is you know what's right and wrong, and you decide to do the wrong thing anyways. We call that a failure of character. There isn't a lot we can do to teach people that failures of character are wrong, right? That you already know they're wrong, but you're choosing to do it anyway. You can impose consequences and prison and all kinds of stuff to try to discourage failures of character. But it really depends. It's this idea that a person knows what's wrong and does something anyways. All right. I'm not going to spend too much time on failure of character. I'm hoping that one's pretty obvious, but we're going to move on to a different scenario that talks about other types of failures when it comes to ethics. So this we call the fast food dilemma. So a teenager applying for their very first job in the US at a fast food restaurant is asked to respond to the following scenario, right? You see another employee give food to their friends. Would you ignore them, confront them, or talk to the manager? This is a question on a survey to see if you can get hired to work as a fast food worker. Well, the teenager looks and says, well, I would ignore it because I don't know the situation, right? I don't know the context. Maybe those people are hungry. Maybe they don't have money. Maybe, and I would never deny a hungry person food. This actually happened. This was one of my teenagers. And this is not a failure of character, right? But if they actually turned in this answer to the question, they don't get the job. Why is that, right? It's not because they had a failure of character. I mean, I like to think I raised a morally sound child in the context of our culture. And that the fact that they want to feed people that are hungry is good, in my opinion. However, in this particular context, it was still a failure of ethics. And then what we call this is a failure of knowledge or failure of expertise. And the idea is it's not only good to know what's right and wrong, but that will change based on context, especially in a professional setting. You need knowledge of the setting. Oh, by the way, what was the right answer to the question is go talk to the manager, because it's not your food to let get away, and it's not your job to make that decision. And so that was the right answer to go with that, if there's a right answer. Always ethics, there's never a truly right answer. All right. So moral decisions require knowledge. My teenager needed to learn and understand why ignoring it was bad in that particular context, why talking to the manager was the appropriate response to that situation. And we talked through that as because my teenager could talk to me about that, and I was a source of information. But we don't always have parents to walk us through these situations. We need to think about these as critical skills. We need to understand the context of the field that we're in. We need to understand potential actions that could be taken. Like, we might only know of a few, but there might be others that we are not aware of. There's a lot of lack of knowledge and a lot of experience that can cause you to get into ethical quandaries, especially in a professional setting where you don't have the information that you want. So let's talk about an ethical decision-making process, right? The first step, we can teach ethical decision-making. There are processes. This is just one of them. There are lots of them. And thinking about ethics when you make a decision or put a plan together can really help make sure that you're trying your best to do the right thing. You need to teach knowledge, skills, attitudes, behavior. Oops, thought there was one more. Right. It's not just understanding what's right and wrong, because that's a cultural thing and it will vary based on context. So when you're talking about a professional situation, you need to think about what's right and wrong, and you need to practice that skill and have the people around you practice that skill. Or what will happen is, if you don't pay attention to what is ethically right and wrong in your area of practice, people tend to ignore it and bad things happen, right? You can get into situations where people don't put ethics on the front of their decision-making process. Then these ethical problems will appear to themselves. And then there's a comment from Laura: if there's no willingness to be ethical, then it's not teachable. Absolutely. If you have a failure of character, that I said we're not going to worry about that one. If you truly are just know what's ethical and decide not to do that, that's a failure of character. However, what I'm saying, even with a failure of knowledge, you can create an environment where ethics aren't thought about very often and not brought to the forefront. And it's easier to have a failure of character in an environment where ethics are not brought to the forefront. Yes, I am assuming that people want to be ethical, which I would argue most people do. Most. So here's an ethical decision-making process that you can use for a lot of things. It's pretty generic. Once you define what problem you're trying to solve for whatever job you're in, you want to also think about the ethical issues associated with that problem. You, of course, go out and get relevant information and assistance, right? You say, okay, there are ethical issues. Let's do some research and find out what they mean, if other people have dealt with this, and what possible things could happen if we deal with this wrong. What are the negative consequences of us making a decision incorrectly or correctly? How does that affect us? And what are the ethical implications of that decision-making process? And you want to consider all the different outcomes and say, what are the impacts of each? What is the impact of not doing something? That might have an ethically negative thing to happen. What's the impact of doing something? That also might have an ethical implication, both negative and positive. And so you've got to really think those things through and try to predict. Now, you can't tell the future, but the idea here is you're keeping the ethics in your head when you're making the decision-making process. I have to deal with this a lot. I'm just going to tell a personal story. I do machine learning and data science, right? That's sort of my area of research. And I have to teach the students about, the ethics and the bias associated with data science, especially when you use tools like machine learning, right? We have to have that conversation all the time. And a lot of times we want to just try something to see how it works. But it's really important, in my opinion, to step aside before you try an experiment and say, okay, what outcomes are we expecting and where might our biases be, especially in the data, in our assumptions that we're making, and could running this experiment amplify those biases, could lead to an ethical decision that is not correct. We want to think about that before you look at the results so that you're not having a confirmation bias when you see the results. And it's sort of a hard problem, but I try to teach our students how to do that. Then once you make your decision, you want to implement it, right? You've said, okay, we've decided to go this route. We're going to implement the decision, and then we're going to get an outcome to the problem. Now, the problem's different than the ethical. Did we solve the problem or not is a different question. But then we really want to evaluate what were the ethical outcomes of the problems. Did the things happen that we predicted? Did they go in the direction we wanted, or did something else happen? I would argue that it's not a failure of ethics, that if you tried to go through this process to the best of your ability to be as ethical as you can, and it's still the outcome could be unethical. That's not a failure of character. That was just a failure of knowledge, but maybe knowledge that you didn't have until you've conducted whatever problem solving you're doing. So it's a little tricky, but the harder part, or the way where people, I think, get into the most problems is when they try to ignore the ethics or think, oh, that's someone else's problem, to think about it. We get into real serious problems. I teach a lot of engineering as engineers, where if you have to think about the ethics beforehand, not after. All right, sorry, that's my little soapbox for now. But how do we teach this level of knowledge to new people in our fields? How do we establish what is the right standards? How do we establish the culture of a field? And this has actually been thought of quite a bit, and these are called codes of ethics. So their sole purpose of codes of ethics, and you'll see these in professional organizations, you'll see these primarily in professional organizations, where you lay out what is expected from people in those organizations. It describes your ethical values and gives you specific decision-making guidelines to help you when you're in these situations. I've actually seen lots of things like codes of conduct as well, where you'll see those at a conference or something, which helps drive ethical behavior in certain situations. Like how should you behave in a online workshop so that you're not being disrupted. Those are also very helpful because you might not know, and this is a whole point of these codes of ethics, is to provide information so that you have a resource you can look up if you don't know what's the right thing to do. So here are 3 examples of disciplinary codes of ethics that I won't send you to these links. We actually put miniaturized copies of these of the computing code of ethics in your handout. And so what I want you to be aware of is that lots of fields have codes of ethics. I've actually had this conversation this week with some people. Research facilitators, we're a new professional organization. You can think of Campus Champions, you can think of CARC and some others. We're trying to build research facilitation as a profession. Maybe someone should consider writing a code of ethics for us and putting some case studies together so that we could share that with the group. I don't know, I just thought it was an idea, just planting that seed. But what we're going to do now is we're going to review a code of ethics in your breakout room again. And if you don't want to go to the breakout room, don't feel like you have to log off. You can stay in the main room. We're happy to chat here or let you be. You don't have to go into the breakout room if you don't want to. I want you to stay here so that you don't leave completely. Or you can lurk in the breakout room if you want. Just, turn off your mic and just lurk for a bit. If you want, you can put a Z in front of your username. That's a good trick that we use sometimes to just let other people know that they don't want to talk in a breakout room. And already I see people logging off because they don't like breakout rooms. But stay. It's a good thing. So we're going to go into breakout rooms. I want you to review the code of ethics, which were in the handout, and I will put the handout link in the chat again. And then what we're going to do from there, oops, I didn't hit enter. Oops, and I only send that to one person. Everyone in meeting, there you go. There's the link handout. I want you to review this code of ethics. I want you to, there's a case study or a couple of case studies. I can't remember how many there were at the end. And then the idea is you read the case study and it presents an ethical quandary where a lack of knowledge is the issue, not a lack of character. And then you want to try to apply this case study to that ethical issue. And just have a discussion about it, see what you notice, see what you don't notice. And hey, my GeForce game driver is all ready, guys. Isn't that wonderful? There, I'll turn that off. Yeah, so let's do this. Oops, no chatter yet. I'm going to open up the breakout rooms. Let's see, how are we doing time-wise? We'll give you about 10 minutes to do this, and then we'll come back and have a wrap-up discussion. So enjoy your discussion. Oops, there's a bunch of people not assigned.
Yeah, one of the things I found myself doing yesterday was creating a little PowerPoint slide that told people what to do if they arrived late.
Oh, that's a smart idea. I like that.
Well, because last year when I didn't do that, what happened was they would notice that they were late and then notice that there was nobody there, like they weren't doing anything, and they would figure, oh, I'm screwed. I might as well drop. And if I didn't get to them in 15 seconds and get them assigned to a breakout room, they were gone. And so I realized I had to put up the thing that just said, please wait, and we will put you in a breakout room. Just we'll be there. And that helped immensely. I think here it won't matter because it's only 10 minutes. There it was 45 minutes. So
I love that idea.
We'll keep track of it for next time.
Why keep track? Done.
my guess is this close to the end of the session, we're probably not going to see much of that, but
I agree.
it's good to bear in mind
mostly to
for
remind myself that it was a great idea.
Yeah, I think so. Next time we'll anticipate it. So it was interesting yesterday when I was rotating the judges in one direction and the researchers in the opposite direction. Rotating the researchers worked well, and rotating the judges was tricky because I would forget who I had just pushed into a room. And I realized after I'd done it 3 times, and it only took me 3 times to figure this out, that I should have worked my way from room 13 up to room 1 for the judges as I was doing room 1 to room 13 for the researchers in the opposite direction. That hadn't even occurred to me until I was just finishing the 3rd round of it, and I was like, oh, that was a stupid thing to do. Okay, well, hopefully I'll remember next year, which I probably won't because a year will have gone by, but still.
Yeah, once I was
time consuming to move to rotate the judges and researchers yesterday. And the biggest issue was I had to make sure that what I ended up with was rooms where everybody had at least one judge plus their researcher. And that took a lot of work. And I ended up having to close down one of the rooms.
Yeah, once I was moved twice within 2 minutes, so that wasn't very helpful.
I think I moved you into a room that had 3 judges.
Oh, okay.
But it's really hard to keep track because if you move 2 judges into a room that has 2 judges, the probability that you'll remember which 2 you just moved is very low, at least for me. I have very poor short-term memory.
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks.
To the general principle, not that particular one.
Yes. I'm enjoying the whiz as you furiously backpedal.
All right, I didn't actually. I wish they had a timer on the breakout room app.
Yeah, unfortunately not.
So when did I hit go?
I think
it was like 42 or something, I think.
Oh,
it hasn't been that long.
Perfect.
Maybe
it was 5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes is fine. 5 more minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I found it was useful to give them a 2-minute warning.
Oh.
I'm going to, I don't know if you can hear them, but I'm going to go tell my kids to quiet down. I'll be back.
We can't hear them.
Well, still, they're annoying me.
That's fine.
I'll be back.
All right. Hey, pipe down, you. Oh, it just happened. We had someone show up and I tried to put them in a room and they had already dropped.
Oh, darn.
Yeah. And that is the usual behavior. I literally, I saw that they were there. I went and clicked to move them and gone. So Dirk, just to get into the spirit of things, I went and told my kids to pipe down too. And they looked at me like I was weird because they weren't making any noise. I said, well, I just want to get in on that action. So, and my 15-year-old called me a weirdo.
I have a 15-year-old as well.
Yeah, they're fun.
You're doing driver's training right now?
No, she became eligible 12 days ago, and I can't convince her. Although I haven't really leaned on her that hard because I had this to contend with.
Oh, we've been doing it almost a year now.
How's it been going?
They're safe. They're just very hesitant. I have to keep teaching them that doing something different, doing something that the other driver doesn't expect is unsafe, even if you're slower or you need to be, your behavior needs to be expected by the other person. And so driving super slow is unexpected.
Yes.
Are you teaching him how to do a standard transmission?
No, we don't have one. I would,
Oh,
but
darn. Yeah. It's a good skill to learn for sure.
well, it's one of those things is I'm expecting them to have electric cars. And
Yeah.
yeah, I used to, we always had a standard until we got a lot of kids and none of my friends could drive a standard. And so every time I wanted to borrow a car and we wanted to trade or something, it always became a pain.
Mhm.
And then I got my hybrid and then
I've had a mix. I've had a mix over the years, and the last stick we had was when my wife and I first got together. She had a Mustang, and it was purple and had a pink stripe. And she got pregnant, and so suddenly that was my car because she couldn't jackknife herself into it anymore. And I hated that car with a white hot fury. It was not because it was a stick. I've always been perfectly comfortable driving a stick. It was because every single thing about it was the exact opposite of what I needed or wanted. So I couldn't get rid of that thing fast enough.
I'm going to give a 2-minute warning.
Good idea.
Henry, our last one was a Fiat. And it was as cute as it could be. It was this beautiful blue. I got to tell you, I think that Fiat is Italian for fix it again, Tony.
Yeah.
It was always in the shop, always.
Yeah. So my general philosophy is if I spend more in a year on repairs than it would have cost to do a year's worth of payments on a new one, I buy the new one.
Yep. Yeah.
Oh, hey, the guy who I moved into room 1 is now in room 1 just after the 2-minute warning went.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm.
A lot of people on here. Hi, everyone. You can talk too.
Hi, Henry. Hi, Dirk.
Oh, yeah, we are recording, Henry. So you get all this on the recording.
Perfect.
Did I say anything inappropriate?
No.
Probably not.
No. I just think it's funny.
All right, I'm going to close the rooms because it's been about a minute. And then that will give them a 60-second warning. Is my screen still being shared properly?
It
Yeah.
looks like it to me. Yep.
Yeah, it just shows the breakout rooms.
Mhm.
And then we wait. The camera keeps drifting. We've got 5 seconds, everyone. 3, 2, 1. All right, everybody, welcome back. I hope that was a good discussion. Yeah, let's find out. Was that a good session? What did you learn? Type something in your chat window. Do not hit enter yet. And think about I've been talking here and I was muted the whole time. So,
No, sorry, it was just now. That was my fault.
oh, okay. I don't know how much you heard of that, but what I want you to do is I want you all to type something you learned in. Hopefully you learned something during that discussion, maybe something you didn't know, something interesting about codes of ethics, something that you think was missing. Type that into the chat and we'll say in 3, 2, 1, enter. Go ahead and hit your enter. It is a complicated question. Is the issue an unknown bug that could identify proficient? Good intentions may have broader ethical implications. That's true. We all have a strong commitment to being ethical. Honestly, I find that with most people. And honestly, if you have what I've discovered, and I'm just going on a tangent here, is if you look at the news and where unethical things happen, it's typically in businesses that have a culture of not thinking about ethics or having a culture that promotes unethical behavior. And so you want to be the person that has these conversations. You want to be the one to bring up, hey, have we thought about, your brother's calling me, have a thought about the ethical issues. You want to create a culture that it's okay to have these conversations. And I think a lot of the professional organizations try to do that, especially with these codes of ethics. But it's really hard sometimes if you're in the wrong environment. Oh, I wasn't. Okay, so let's see. What other things we say? Had a hard time understanding the scenario. Yeah, there's a lot of ambiguity in this case. And it's hard to write small case studies that fit on a screen that have all the details that you need to make all the ethical decisions. That's just the nature of the training part. But in any context, you might not have all the information. And so you still have to make as best you can ethical decisions, even when you don't have the context. And sometimes, those decisions are, if you don't have information, you have to say, if this information existed, this is the decision I would make. If it's one way versus the other, and just, move on with your ethical plan. Yeah, this is good stuff. All right. So we had 2 mini sessions today. Remember we started talking about unconscious bias and the types of biases that we have. Biases are normal. We all have them. It's just a normal part of life. But what happens is our biases, especially our unconscious biases, might conflict with what we consciously believe. And that's not uncommon. And so you have to try to make yourself aware of your unconscious bias. We had those coping strategies that were Mary mentioned, like what are your triggers that trigger your unconscious biases? And can you then overcome that knee-jerk reaction to react to the bias instead of reacting to the true facts that are going on and what your conscious mind wants to be true? And this is a hard thing. I've had to struggle with it myself. One of the things you can do is try to do better at job interviews because they're a famous place. There's lots of evidence that in job interviews, there's bias in what the decisions we make, especially like me biases. You get someone in a job interview that really likes you or that you connect with, maybe you come from the similar background. It's natural to want to hire them, even if they're not the best candidate, because you have this affinity bias with them. And so you can put things in places during your interview process to try to protect yourself from making these decisions based on your bias instead of based on the facts. One of the tricks that we use, for example, is we write up all the questions we're going to ask. And then we can be consistent across interviews with the same set of questions. And that helps with the affinity bias. I even go so far as I send the questions out to the people that we're interviewing, and I say, here's the questions we're going to ask you. And people say, oh, no, you got to surprise them. But no, giving them time to think about it can be very insightful. And especially when I get a candidate that I've given the questions to and then ask those questions and they are not prepared, that gives me a lot of insight about whether I want to hire that person or not. And so those are just some examples. Also, just knowing that there might be bias is really good. So we talked a lot about that. I'm digressing. And then we talked a little bit about ethical issues and the two types of failures that can happen during an ethical issue. You have the failure of character. I can't do much with that one. If you choose to go against the ethics, we can model good behavior and we can encourage good behavior by creating culture, but ultimately that is a personal failure of character, is a personal decision. But what we can do, and what often happens, is a failure of knowledge, and those are a failure of experience. And if you don't, you might know you want to do the thing, but you don't know how to do it. And things like codes of ethics can really help ground a discussion to try to guide people. But it's never an obvious issue, and it always will have an answer of what is ethical. It sort of depends on the situation. And so, but that failure of knowledge is something we can work towards by building policies and doing training so that we can try our best to have some, to remove that lack of knowledge. All right. That's all I had for today. What questions do you have?
Can you give some other examples of things you guys do to make your hiring process more fair? I was really I thought the one about sending out the questions seemed really great.
So I've personally noticed in my own life, one of my biases that I have is for that I'm trying to overcome is I have a bias towards extroverts. I'm a kind of an extroverted person. I kind of like people that are boisterous and noisy like me. But some of my best people that I work with are introverts, and it's intimidating to work with me for some. I've gotten feedback, let's put it this way, that it's intimidating to work with me because, you know, I want to go out. I want to be with the people that I work with. And so I've worked really hard to work better with introverts because I don't want to be biased against them. And so I found that the question thing is really good for that, because if I do a spontaneous question, it tends to bring out the extroverts well, but it can bias against the introverts in the group. And that's one of the reasons I do that activity. And it's trying to get over my own biases and trying to make it more fair. I've been trying this gendered coding, trying to find ways to do better gender coding. It's a little hard. There are some tools that can help with that when I do job ads, because I want to try to get the richest pool of candidates I can. And I don't want to have them self-select away from my job just because I worded something inappropriately that turns them off. And so I've been working on that as well. And then we always do before any interviews here at the university, we have a whole process we have to go through, a training we have to go through. And the training is just there to put it in your head, because that alone can help in the process. So as you just remind everybody that we have these biases before has shown a great decrease in people's bias outcomes. Like even if like you're reviewing resumes, you tell a group, remember that you might have bias, and you don't tell another group. The science shows that the group that you reminded does a better job ignoring the bias, because I think ethically we all don't want to have the biases. They're just built in. And so it's good to remind us about that every once in a while. I don't know if that answered your question. I just like to babble. At OSU, we have a search advocate program. In each faculty search, there is one person. Yes, we have that too. And when we have training that everybody has to go through as well. Yeah, I found it interesting that reminding makes a difference. Actually, the NSF, there's science that's done this, and the NSF took that to heart. And so anytime you do a proposal review for the NSF, if any of you have had the opportunity to do that, they make you go through a video reminding you about implicit bias, and they've shown that that alone can significantly improve the outcome of their decision-making process, which I think is really great. It's a simple thing to do. All right, I'm over time, Henry. I don't know. I don't mind sticking around and talking, but I don't want to also take into people's lunch hour.
Are there any additional questions? I don't mind running a few minutes over.
I ruined it by mentioning lunch.
Yes, now people will drop like flies. All right. Well, it sounds like we're done with questions, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.